She was a mistress who became a monarch, a woman whose ambition changed the course of English history and lost her head to the cold steel of the executioner's sword. This is not the Anne Boleyn you were taught in school. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, is often remembered simply for her rise, her fall, and her infamous execution. But history has done her a disservice. Today we uncover the remarkable story of a queen who was not only cunning and fearless, but who also played a deadly game of power, passion, and politics at the Tudor court. Anne was likely born around the year 1501, though her exact birth date remains uncertain. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a well-connected diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, part of one of England's most powerful noble families. Anne's early life wasn't spent in England's royal court, but in the far more sophisticated courts of Europe. She served in the Netherlands under Margaret of Austria and later in France with Queen Claude. There, she absorbed the ideas of the Renaissance, languages, fashion, music, religious reform, and saw firsthand how court power really worked. She returned to England in the 1520s as one of the most polished, intelligent women at court, fluent in French, trained in diplomacy, and completely unlike the English noblewomen of the time. Back in England, Anne quickly attracted attention for her wit, charm, and striking presence. Early on, she became briefly engaged to Henry Percy, the heir to the powerful Percy family, Earls of Northumberland, one of the most influential noble houses in the north of England. However, this engagement was quietly broken off, likely due to political pressure and rivalries at court. It was during her time serving in Queen Catherine of Aragon's household that Anne's fate truly began to shift. As a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, Anne was thrust into the heart of Tudor politics and court intrigue. This position gave her invaluable insight into the workings of the royal household and brought her into close contact with King Henry VIII himself. More importantly, it was here that Anne's sharp mind and ambition caught the eye of powerful courtiers, and ultimately the king. Unlike her sister Mary Boleyn, who had been Henry's mistress, Anne refused to be seduced. Instead, she kept Henry intrigued, even desperate. He wrote her at least 17 love letters, many of which still survive today. In them, Henry confesses to being pierced by the dart of love, begs for her favor, and even offers marriage if she'll return his affection. Remarkably, these letters are now housed in the Vatican Library, an ironic twist, given that the Pope's refusal to annul Henry's first marriage would eventually lead to England's break from Rome. How they ended up there is still uncertain, but they offer an intimate glimpse into a king infatuated and a woman who knew exactly how to keep him wanting more. But Anne's strategy wasn't just flirtation. It was a masterclass in Tudor realpolitik. This wasn't about love. This was about power. Anne didn't want to be another mistress. She wanted a crown. And Henry believed she was worth it. Henry's obsession turned political. Anne had convinced him, not just through flirtation, but through strategy, that she was destined to give him the male heir Catherine never could. She knew what Henry feared most: a kingdom without a strong male successor. Catherine had given him only one surviving daughter, and a string of lost sons had begun to look like divine judgment. Anne offered him a different story, one of hope, promise, and destiny. She skillfully framed Catherine's failures as spiritual proof that the marriage had been cursed from the start. After all, Catherine had been married to Henry's brother first, a fact Anne subtly used to suggest their union was against God's law. In contrast, Anne positioned herself as the woman who would redeem the Tudor line and secure the dynasty. But Anne's genius wasn't just in what she said. It was what she withheld. For years she denied Henry sexually, something no other woman at court dared to do. And it worked. The longer she kept him at arm's length, the more convinced he became that she was no ordinary mistress. When she finally gave in, it was with a purpose. She timed her first pregnancy to coincide with their secret marriage and public coronation. To Henry, it felt like fate unfolding. She emphasized her youth and vitality, in sharp contrast to the aging Catherine. At a time when miscarriages were blamed on the mother, Anne played the part of the healthy, fertile woman chosen to bear England's future king. The idea that her body could succeed where Catherine's had failed became a cornerstone of Henry's belief. But to marry Anne, Henry needed an annulment, and the Pope refused. This is where Anne's strategy proved revolutionary. She had introduced Henry to reformist ideas, including texts by William Tyndale, an English theologian and early Protestant reformer whose writings openly questioned the Pope's authority. Anne didn't just want marriage. She wanted religious reform. Her interest in reform was rooted in her youth, spent at the French and Burgundian courts, hubs of early Protestant and humanist thought. There she read Erasmus, a Dutch Renaissance scholar and theologian whose works emphasized education, critical thinking, and a return to the original texts of the Bible. Erasmus advocated for reform within the Church through reason and morality rather than rebellion, promoting ideas like personal piety and the importance of Scripture in the vernacular. Anne also absorbed the teachings of French evangelicals and developed a quiet but sincere belief in challenging church corruption and emphasizing a direct, personal relationship with faith. She supported Protestant thinkers, smuggled forbidden books into England, and aligned herself with rising political forces who wanted to break Rome's grip. For Anne, reform wasn't just ideology. It was power, survival, and the future of the crown. By 1533, Henry declared himself head of the Church of England, breaking from papal authority through the Acts of Supremacy passed by Parliament. He married Anne in secret, defying Rome's refusal to annul his first marriage, and crowned her queen, not just as a consort, but as a symbol of a new religious order that placed the English monarch above the Church. Anne was crowned with St. Edward's crown, a symbol traditionally reserved for monarchs. It was a signal. Henry saw her not just as a wife, but as the future mother of his dynasty. But when Anne gave birth to a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, the pressure on her to produce a male heir only intensified. Over the next 3 years, Anne suffered at least 3 documented miscarriages. Each loss deepened the king's impatience and frustration, and as these pregnancies ended in tragedy, Henry's affection for Anne began to wane. The warmth that once defined their relationship grew cold, overshadowed by the desperate hope for a son who never came. Still, Anne remained politically active, pushing for religious reform, appointing allies to key positions, and fiercely battling courtiers who hated her, including Thomas Cromwell, who would ultimately become her greatest enemy. In 1536, Anne's world began to crumble. She had given Henry no surviving male heir, and the king's attentions had shifted to a quiet, compliant lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. But Anne's fall wasn't just about a fading romance or a failed pregnancy. It was political and calculated. At the center of it was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. Once her ally in the Reformation, Cromwell had become one of her fiercest enemies. Both reformers, Anne and Cromwell's visions diverged dramatically. Anne wanted the church reformed theologically, a purer, more Protestant England. Cromwell wanted to strip the church of its wealth and consolidate royal power through economic reform and bureaucracy. Their agendas clashed. Anne pushed back against Cromwell's policies, especially how he handled the dissolution of the monasteries. She accused him of corruption and even suggested he wasn't reforming for the right reasons. At one point, she threatened his position at court. Worse, Anne tried to persuade Henry to form foreign alliances Cromwell opposed, particularly with reformist German princes. And she actively planted her allies in key positions, undermining Cromwell's growing network. Cromwell knew something dangerous. Anne wasn't afraid to speak directly to the king. She didn't wait for backroom deals. That made her unpredictable and expendable. And she wasn't just Cromwell's problem. She was deeply unpopular at court. The old nobility saw her as an upstart commoner, a Howard Boleyn hybrid who had risen too high, too fast. Many still supported Queen Catherine and viewed Anne as a homewrecker, a witch, even a French-educated heretic. Foreign ambassadors, particularly Eustace Chapuis of Spain, fueled anti-Anne sentiment. He famously refused to acknowledge her as queen, always calling her the concubine. His reports back to Emperor Charles V cast Anne as manipulative and dangerous. When Anne miscarried a male child in early 1536, it was the moment her enemies had been waiting for. Cromwell moved swiftly. Within weeks, he orchestrated a web of false confessions, forced testimonies, and fabricated evidence to charge Anne with adultery, incest, and high treason. 5 men were arrested, including her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. Anne was arrested, interrogated, and taken to the Tower of London. The trial was a farce. Closed-door sessions, coached witnesses, and no real defense. Anne, even under immense pressure, held her composure. She insisted on her innocence, and, by all modern historical consensus, she was telling the truth. Still, on May 15th, 1536, Anne was found guilty. Her brother and the 4 other men, guilty. The sentence, death. 4 days later, at the age of 35, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold wearing a grey damask and a vivid crimson-red kirtle, the colour of martyrdom. And she didn't go quietly. In her final speech, she praised the king, prayed for mercy on her soul, and then, with tragic calm, knelt before the French executioner. A single stroke of the sword ended her life. But Anne Boleyn's story didn't end in the Tower. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was initially declared illegitimate after Anne's execution because Henry VIII's marriage to Anne was annulled, and their daughter was considered born out of wedlock. This stigma could have ended Elizabeth's chances at power. Yet she would rise above it to become one of the most powerful monarchs in English history. Under Elizabeth I, England would defeat the Spanish Armada, expand its influence, and embrace a lasting Protestant identity. Anne's vision realized. Over time, Anne Boleyn became more than a queen. She became a symbol of ambition, betrayal, and defiance. To some, she was a brilliant strategist who outwitted kings and ministers. To others, she was a dangerous manipulator who brought ruin to the realm. Her legacy has always been divided: saint or sinner, heroine or homewrecker. But one truth endures. Anne's power didn't come solely from her crown. It came from her conviction, a sharp intellect, an unshakable vision that reshaped England's political and spiritual landscape. Anne wasn't just the woman who lost her head. She was the catalyst for a national religious revolution, a queen who demanded to be seen, A woman who changed the future and paid the ultimate price. Thank you for watching. If you found Anne's story compelling, consider subscribing for more untold stories of powerful figures and the turning points that shaped the world. Who should we explore next? Let us know in the comments below.